But I have a question for you. What's your perspective or belief as to why women and or minorities are paid less now?
Well, I think it's a product of from my perspective, it's a product of um, like the way in which we structure capitalist enterprise, and um, again, like the idea of like privilege versus being um, like institutionally oppressed or experiencing institutional oppression, right? It's just another way in which women are and other and other communities are held back, and the barriers that are kind of put in their way. Because I mean, if you think about it, if you pay uh, people less money for the same labor, um, that doesn't mean that living costs less. So you're kind of perpetually keeping that cycle of um, keeping that individual in subjugation to those of more privilege. So it's like a cycle. It keeps going,
Hmm.
keeps going.
For sure. And I guess how would you then how would you then say that our generation can try and correct this and l- make a trend towards equality?
I really I have a lot of faith in our generation. Like I really feel that we are doing and are going to continue to do really great things. But actually, if you would indulge me, I would love um, to sort of point out something that was said. It's the particular use of the word equality. I actually
Hmm.
don't think that. I think that we shouldn't really strive towards equality. I don't really. Equality is really not like I don't think it's good enough. I think we should strive to be more equitable. And the difference between equality and equity is very it's big, and it's very different. And so I think really the goal should be this like kind of turn away from equality to a more equitable society.
Okay. And could you give a little bit more insight into what that society based on equity would I guess look like?
So I mean, that's really hard. Like I can only like speculate on what it might look like, and obviously, again, I want to mention that I have a lot of learning to still do, but
You're the expert.
but for me, the way in which I understand equity is equity kind of functions on the premise or the ideal, or kind of there's an understanding that not everybody starts in the same place because of, again, institutional oppression and privilege, and, where and when and who you're born to. You kind of start at a different place. You don't really, there's, everybody has a different starting line. And so equity takes that into account, and it would kind it kind of assumes that and attempts to um, create more of an even playing field. So if I were to kind of give an analogy, I would say, right, if I would have three different students, right? And I were to say, okay, guys, time to take an exam. And, all these three different students were different. Maybe one of them was me, and I can speak from my experience, right? Um, I am both motor impaired and I'm also visually impaired. So it takes me a while to write stuff down, and I also get a lot of eye strain. And let's say we had three other people, one other person that was more typically able, and then maybe the third kind of student was a fish in a fishbowl, and I was like, okay, guys, here's a paper and pencil. You each have an hour. Take this test, right? That would be equality because I'm giving you each the same thing, right? You each have an hour. You each have a paper and a pencil. But the paper and a pencil is not really going to do much for the fish. And the hour long time to take the test and also the paper and a pencil might really not do much for me. I might be kind of leaps behind if someone doesn't help me write this exam, right? And the fact that the fish, or maybe a different labeled student, or someone else, or really anyone, we don't have to just think about this from the perspective of of a different labeled person, right? This could really apply to a whole host of different situations, right? The fact that the fish is not going to be able to perform well on this exam is not a result of its merit. It's a result of the fact that you gave a fish a paper and a pencil. That's like not going to do anything. So equity would kind of take that into account and would give everybody, what they needed, nothing more, nothing less, to be able to race more fairly, to take this exam more fairly and demonstrate their abilities, right? It is only in an equitable society that meritocracy is true. Before that, meritocracy, we can throw that in the bin, in my opinion, right? Meritocracy is a myth right now. And it will be a myth until we figure out how to be a bit more equitable.
I was just about to ask about meritocracy. Yeah, that's okay. I definitely see how that is. It's actually
Does that make sense?
yeah. I definitely, I think I understand that. Yeah, I think I don't know if you heard recently, but the college boards like AP exams are like online now, and
Yeah.
there's one student recently who filed a complaint saying that they were discriminating against blind and deaf students because they like, I guess they couldn't really take the tests online like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like an interesting, like, I mean, like how do you make that equality? Like, you got to make it equitable and to actually make it, you know, have an equal opportunity, fair opportunity. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, these questions and these solutions are really, really big, right? These issues are not small, and they're not going to be solved by one person. They're not going to be solved by 100 people, and they're not going to be solved by even 1 million people. They're going to be solved by a massive collective effort. That's really the only way. If we put people's brains together and we come up with solutions to make that work. I think one of the positives that we have kind of going for us is advances in technology. I think if we understand the ethical implications of advancing technology and we make an effort to mitigate a lot of the negative ethical implications that technology could impose on us and harness it for good, which is way easier said than done. I think we can have a huge ally on our side in terms of creating that equity.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's why just being aware of other people's issues is such a powerful thing. Because once you're aware, you can understand or you can resonate with someone of like what they're going through.
Yeah, definitely.
I have a quick question for you. So when it comes to, I don't know if you've ever contemplated the argument of equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. So I'm just curious, like, how would you identify, like, which may take precedent, or which one would be more valuable, or which would you be inclined to lean towards?
Um, it's interesting because equality of outcome kind of implies that everybody kind of ends at the same place, and that's not and that's not necessarily what would be realistic. And I also don't think that's what equity is really about. I think a lot of times when people criticize others for saying and wanting more equity and creating more equitable policy, there's kind of this criticism of, well, you just kind of like want everybody to be the same and everybody to sort of, get, the same place, and there be no competition. And that's really not, equalizing outcomes. I personally don't feel is what equality or equity is about. But it's about, I guess you could say, equal opportunity, of being able to get there, right? Having the same chance of being able to get to an equally or an equivalent outcome as someone else who perhaps could have the advantage in like a less equitable setting. It's kind of leveling the playing field. Now, does that necessarily mean that everybody ends on the same, ends at the same time, finishes the race at the same time? That doesn't necessarily have to be true, but that everybody kind of has kind of a baseline and kind of a safety net. So, it means that, nobody is poor, nobody lacks access, a whole host of things, right? That everybody kind of has like a basic standard of safety and standard of living.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of that made sense.
I'm still processing, but no, I understand what you're trying to say. And it makes sense. I mean, it seems logical, but I feel like it's hard for other people to realize.
Yeah, it's really hard for us to restructure the ways in which we've constructed things, like the concepts like the American dream, right? This idea that like if you work hard and you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, like you can achieve anything, right? That's like a classic American ideal, and I think it can be really hard for people to realize that the American dream is a myth, right? If you work hard, your hard work doesn't necessarily equal you being able to achieve a certain degree of success, because America and the rest of the world is not a meritocracy as it stands right now. And I think that can be a very hard pill to swallow for a whole lot of people that hold a lot of pride in themselves and their individuality, but also just hold a lot of hope in that ideal that, one day things will be better, or, that they'll be able to get to a certain place one day and they'll be able to sort of achieve their goals. And the only thing standing between them and their goals is their effort. And I think it can feel very hopeless to kind of, have that reality check and be like, well, that's not true. You have a whole lot of barriers in front of you, and how hard you try doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to get to point X. It's just more of an indication of how many barriers you have along the way, as opposed to your merit, because that feels much less powerless, right? We feel so much less powerless when we look at it from that perspective. It feels disheartening almost.
Yeah, I think that's that's definitely true. And I've heard of one, metaphor for how that kind of works out. I guess specifically with people in below the poverty line, is that them getting to a place of more prosperity is like crossing a minefield. I don't know if you've heard that before, but yeah. So basically getting from one side to the other, like it's possible, but it's so hard because every couple of steps forward, you're gonna hit a landmine, and then in that scenario, it'd be like maybe they lose their car, and some kind of they get into some trouble, and it's just this constant battle, despite how hard they're working. Like it's such a fine line to get through all those obstacles, and that's just kind of like the reality of how that works out with the whole American dream working hard. But
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we could definitely think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. Go. Speak. It's okay.
And I think we could definitely, we're kind of in a current situation that allows us to think about that even more, right? We can definitely think of that in context to the current pandemic, right? So a lot of people are really becoming destitute right now, right? They're really kind of being bulldozed financially almost because they cannot afford not to work. And that's a function of how we've structured our society. We've structured it to work efficiently, and efficiency doesn't like that efficiency is contingent upon making it so that people cannot afford to miss a day of work. They can't afford to have a hiccup, even if that hiccup is a pandemic. Right? I think I don't know where it's from, but I think I heard the statistics a while back that the vast majority of Americans uh, uh, don't even have more than $400 in emergency savings, and that is kind of that's on like the sort of better side. Lots of Americans don't have any. Or lots of people around the world don't have something to fall back on if something like this happens, or if something goes wrong anytime, which everybody has stuff happen in their lives. And so I think that's a function of how we have structured ourselves. We have structured ourselves to be to maximize efficiency, and that kind of puts people in a rock and a hard place, because it creates this place that if you stop working, even if it's for a very legitimate reason like a global pandemic, you are left destitute, and you're essentially decimated by that.
Yeah. And I think what yeah, I mean, I don't know if any other system is parallel to ours, but I think our efficiency definitely comes at a certain cost. Like the repercussions that we're seeing now are definitely part of that cost. Maybe there's more, because I feel like when we regain normalcy and things go back to normal, whenever that may be, or if they go back to normal, like it would definitely be hard for people to adjust and go back to their normal jobs or what they were doing before.
You know what's really interesting, actually? I feel like I should probably bring this up, but the countries, I don't know if you guys have seen this yet, but the countries that are dealing with the pandemic, the best, arguably, are all led by women.
Yes.
And Germany with Angela Merkel, and New Zealand, Norway. It's just really interesting how how that it's interesting how that's we're all working out, and I think that maybe speaking to the conversation between maybe male and female leadership styles,
Mhm.
but at the same time, it's maybe we don't have to necessarily categorize it like that. Maybe it's like we should just have leaders that have that balance of strength and compassion.
Mhm.
But I think that's an interesting thing to look at right now in the current state of the world. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it definitely demonstrates like the need, the benefit, and quite frankly, the need for more diversity in leadership. All right, for far too long, we've seen a very homogeneous group of leaders throughout all aspects of the way our world is run, and I think that one example demonstrates the need for more diversity of all different types in leadership. I think we need diverse individuals leading us. We need a group of leadership that is representative of how diverse our world is, and that will kind of bring in diverse perspectives. And I think there is quite a sizable um, empirical like data set and discussion around how the most diverse group of leaders works most efficiently as a group, right? So groups that have the most diverse leadership work the most efficiently.
That's I feel like that's very accurate. But going back to what Menelik said for a second, how like the American fallacy or dream is like a landmine. I feel like I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if you guys were told anything like this, but as I was growing up, especially in America, I think only in America really, people really started to say to me that like in order to be equal to my peers, I would have to work twice as hard. And I've definitely found that to be somewhat true, especially to like a certain extent. And as I'm reaching like levels of higher education, I feel like there is that misnomer between, or there is like a pretty big variance in between the way people are treated. But have you guys found that to be true? Like where um, there's a certain aspect to where you have to work harder than someone else just because you may be more different or unique than to your other peer.
I've definitely found that I think quite a bit in my life. I think I can speak to my own experience, being specifically being a different labeled woman, right? For me, like a really a big pervasive presence in my life is people tend to um, sort of undermine or not view my intelligence to um, a high esteem upon first introduction. So I've heard everything from, I've had a lot of people speak to me as if I can't understand anything. I've had a
Oh
lot of
my
people.
god.
Oh yeah, I mean the list goes on and on, right? I even had this one young woman who was so incredibly shocked that I was going to Colombia and that she was so like flabbergasted. She said that she didn't think that people like me went to places like Columbia. She thought that they went to community colleges.
Oh my.
Um,
Jeez.
The ignorance is unreal.
which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with going to community college, but there is something wrong with assuming that one person goes to community college on the basis of their identity. And it gets really much worse. Like I had people pray over me in the street and pray to heal me And it gets even creepier. I had people legitimately like follow me home because they thought I needed help. And I
Oh
was
my
like,
goodness.
no, I don't need help. Please don't follow me home. Like, I'm good. Like, it's just, it's those, everyday experiences, and they happen quite often, and even like, in school, it was kind of like, even on a different token, it was kind of like, oh, but Selise, like, oh, you don't need any accommodation, right? You don't need a scribe. You're so bright, or what? People would say something like, and it sounds like a compliment, right? It's, people are calling you bright. It sounds like a compliment, but it is a microaggression, because people are like, oh, well, you shouldn't need a scribe or a reader to get through this exam because you're so bright, and they're sort of equating the need for a scribe with someone who maybe, it is not as bright, when in reality those things are not causational, right? One's need for a scribe is not indicative of their level of intelligence, right? So it's even those like tiny microaggressions, that I've experienced in my life, as well. So I can totally relate to this idea of having to work twice as hard, because, um, you know, I think anybody who identifies with a community that is perhaps, more marginalized or experiences more institutional oppression, has the experience of having, having to work harder to overcome barriers that are put in front of, that are put in front of people, because it does require more hard work, and uh, it does require people to, quote unquote, work harder, but that's kind of a toxic, um, phenomenon, because, you know first of all, if people, don't achieve, or are unable to overcome those barriers, we kind of see it as kind of a personal, a personal issue, or, oh, you didn't work hard enough. But in reality, that's not true, and that's kind of an easy cop out for the rest of society to go, well, if you didn't, achieve this particular goal, it's just, it's your merit, or it's your work ethic. It's not, the obstacle society places in front of you, and I think that that's quite a toxic ideology.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't think about it from that perspective, but I think you definitely might be right there.